I'll just start. So, hello and welcome to today's Nutrition and Medical Science BSc Taster session. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Zoe Lee. I'm a current BSc Nutrition and Medical Science student here at UCL and your chair this afternoon. We're hoping that this taster session will address those course specific questions you may have and will help you to gain an insight into what is it really like to study on our nutrition and medical science undergrad program. So, this afternoon, our speaker, Dr. Adrian Slee, will introduce you to some of the great science and medicine that you would learn as a student of nutrition and medical science BSc here at UCL. So Dr. Adrian Slee will also provide a summary of the Nutrition and Medical Science program, and there will be a Q&A session for the second part of the event. This session will be recorded and will be made available on our website following today's event. We're here to respond to your questions, so please share these throughout using the Q&A function on Zoom. So now to introduce our speaker, we have Dr. Adrian Slee.
Thank you very much, Sally. Much appreciated. Hello,
So
everyone. I'll go for it, please.
Sorry, I was just going to introduce you.
Please.
Dr. Adrian Slee is a registered nutritionist and a course director for the BSc in Nutrition and Medical Science at UCL. And Dr. Adrian Slee teaches coordinates several modules on both undergrad and a master program, and teaches topics including nutrition throughout the life cycle and body composition. He also conducts research examining the importance of malnutrition in aging and how it's relevant to fertility. Over to you, Dr. Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you so much appreciated. Let me just share my screen. See if it works. You see that. I'm just going to presentation mode.
Yeah, we can see it.
Super. Brilliant stuff. So thank you so much, Zoe. Right, so welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming this afternoon, and I hope you find this interesting. So we're going to do today a bit of a taster session, just to give you an idea of some of the relevant topics that we cover in our course, and that are also in particular very relevant to our current world that we live in from a nutritional perspective. And then talk about the actual nutrition and medical science degree as well. Just a bit of background about myself. So I'm an associate professor in division medicine. I'm also a registered nutritionist, associate of nutrition, which is, I'll explain to you what that is. That's the governing body for UK nutrition currently. And I'm also the course director for the BSc Nutrition and Medical Sciences degree that's been running for several years now. As Zoe said, I teach on many modules and coordinate and module lead for many modules, both undergraduate and the MSc programs that we have. And I've got a strong interest in areas around malnutrition, something called sarcopenia, which is muscle wasting, and cachexia, a type of wasting condition like cancer, for example, and frailty. And so I have a strong interest in all these different topics, and in particular things like body composition assessment, and how that links to things like health and disease, and clinical outcomes. So hopefully today you get a little bit of insight of the sorts of things that you actually do in the course, and we can talk about how that links to some of these concepts that are really relevant. The other thing just to say that some of the research that I do, for example, sarcopenia concept, looking at muscle wasting, we look at different groups, for example, middle and older aged female and male participants and patients. One of the projects we did was community-based type study, and Zoe was involved with that this summer. So maybe at the end, Zoe, you can talk about your interest. And I just realised on the screen, it's for some reason it only says Dr. Adrian or Dr. Adrian Slee, so it's listen to Tony. But yeah, maybe Zoe, you can talk about that at the end. So when you talk about your experience of being a student. So first question for everyone. So this is just to get you talking and thinking about things on a Monday afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in, obviously. So what do you think we mean by the term energy balance? Has anyone got any ideas? And so we have a chat that's open, and this is just for a bit of fun, just to get some interaction going. Has anyone heard of this concept before? And sorry, if you have a look at the chat, see if anyone has any random thoughts.
Someone said input versus output.
Very good. Does it relate to anything, any issues that we have in our current society? When we're thinking like public health concerns.
Calorie in, calorie out.
Good,
Obesity,
good,
calorie. Um,
super. Yeah, and so that's a really good start actually. And so in nutritional sciences, when we think of energy balance, there are many things in our, especially in public health nutrition, we have a crisis, for example, with the rise of obesity, type 2 diabetes, across the world, both in developed countries, and yes, it's a major issue. And one example is the fact that when we have obesity, which is the inappropriate accumulation of fat mass, it means that over a long period of time, a person has probably been in a positive energy balance state, which means they're consuming over a period of time more calories, you can see here. So consuming more calories than they are expending them. And then when we talk about energy expenditure, we're talking about the calories that you basically burn at rest and with physical activity, the combination of these, okay? So this is a really important thing to understand, okay? And in the research world, this is very interesting. It's also become very current and controversial. And I've seen, for example, even my Apple News feed, and I've seen some interesting research articles that people have put in current news related to, for example, energy expenditure. And so, for example, you might have seen this in the news recently that there's a research group in America who said that actually the major issue we have in our current world is not the fact that maybe we're doing less physical activity, it's the fact that we have a problem with our energy intake and consumption of ultra-processed foods, for example. So you might have seen that in the news. But what we do in our course is we try to say, well, we have certain issues, but we need to understand mechanisms, and we need to understand how we can measure these things. Because at the end of the end of the course, for example, we want you to become nutritionists with good understanding of evidence-based practice and how to properly assess. For example, it could be, well, maybe you become a dietitian in the future, you're actually assessing patients, for example. So how do we do this? Has anyone got any ideas at all? How can we assess our inputs and outputs? Just to see out of interest if anyone has any ideas. And again, feel free to use the chat. So do you think there's any ways that we could measure intake or expenditure or how much energy we have in the body?
BMI, someone said.
Good stuff. Good effort. The classic body mass index we'll talk about in a minute.
Studies and trial.
Yeah, doing studies and trials, but when you talk about some of those methodologies,
Looking at individual body composition and then their exercise and access to food.
that is excellent. That is an excellent answer. And yeah, absolutely. And so you're 100, whoever that was, you're 100% right. Okay? And so we have to think about, first of all, we need to think about inputs. So when we talk about inputs, dietary intake of food, and some nutrients like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, also alcohol as well, because it contains calories. And then the outputs, what are we expending our energy on? So how many calories do we burn per day, both at rest and with exercise? And the other thing to consider is actually what is our body made up of? So our energy reserves. So for example, in muscle tissue, we have reserves of protein, with these dynamic pools of protein that are constantly in a state of flux. And we have fat tissue, for example, like subcutaneous fat tissue that contains stored energy as triglycerides, storage form of energy. Okay. So in our modules, this is what we teach you students. We teach students both theoretically, what this is and how to measure it, but also practically we do practical sessions and show students how to measure these things in the real world. For example, we do dietary analysis, and obviously we have to have a pumpkin here because of the time of year, because of Halloween. And just an example, this is just from a commercial online program, but we use something called Nutritics, a dietary analysis software package, which is actually an online um, um, software that you can use to estimate dietary intake. If you've got a log of someone's diet diary, for example, you can see how many calories someone's consumed. Right? So that's something you can do, but there obviously is pros and cons with different methods. This is something we teach students. But from our example here, you could, for example, put in your pumpkin and see how much carbohydrate, fat, and protein we have in that food. And you may have heard of this before, depending on what you know so far. But we use these things called the Atwater factors. So the idea is this chap developed this concept through research, through studying. It's actually originally used in bomb calorimetry studies, combusting foods and seeing how much energy they have, and then applying other factors to that, with the concept of something called metabolizable energy from food. And so the concept is that you've probably heard this before, that carbohydrate and protein have around 4 kilocalories per gram of energy, and fat is 9 kilocalories per gram, and alcohol is 7. So we can estimate the calorie intake from using these different types of diet recall analysis approaches. There's actually different approaches to doing this. And there's pros and cons with these different types of methods. And that's something, again, that we critically analyze through class, actually. For expenditure, okay, it gets a little bit complicated, but it's very interesting as well. And what we're really doing is we need to try to estimate how much energy, okay, is utilized, both at rest and with exercise. Okay, and then try to relate these things back to metabolism. So you can see here, just out of interest, I'm assuming people have done basic biology, but can you shout out, put in the chat, what's this thing down here? Anyone? Can use the chat here. So I'm going to quickly put something in the chat.
Mitochondria.
Absolutely. So what
A
happens
lot of mitochondria.
Good, excellent. What happens in the mitochondria? Lots of wonderful things.
Respiration.
Yeah, so we essentially produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, with oxidative metabolism. So using oxygen, producing carbon dioxide. So at a cellular level, we can bring this all back into picture. And that's what we do. And I'll explain to you the method in a second. But when we look at energy expenditure, we have to think about it carefully. So over a 24-hour period, we have to think, for example, components. So you can see here, there are actually different components of energy expenditure. You have resting or basal metabolic rate. So if you're completely at rest, it could be after waking up in the morning, after sleep, smoke, having fast, not consuming food, completely at rest, we can measure your energy expenditure. There's another component which is really interesting as well, that sometimes gets a little bit overlooked, is the fact that when you eat a meal, and depending on what's in that meal, actually things like protein, you might have heard this before, it's quite thermogenic. So the idea is that actually through digestion and absorption, assimilation process, this is an energy consuming process. So you have this concept of thermic effect of food. And then the last bit, physical activity, this bit here, this can vary dramatically from person to person. If someone's sedentary, or could be an elite athlete, for example. With elite athletes, for example, say if you're a marathon runner, this could be double the amount overall. Okay, so it can be a huge increase the requirements massively. So that's really important, because it means that, requirements can vary dramatically. So if, for example, some of our students at the end of the course want to become sports nutritionists, working with athletes, you need to understand this properly. Otherwise, if you get it wrong, it can impact on performance and health. So how do we measure it? Okay, so we have to go back to basics. First of all, think about what's actually happening when we talk about metabolism. So if you think that everything that the body needs to do, okay, that requires ATP. So the idea, again, you might have already learned this in biology, so apologies if maybe it's a bit of revision for you, is that adenosine triphosphate, when you break the phosphate bond off, so you go to ATP to ADP, for example, you have some free energy released that can do work. And the idea is that could be used for enzymes, for transport, for example, for ion transport channels, for muscle contraction, for example, for protein synthesis, protein turnover in the body. And so this is already essential stuff, okay? But how do we make ATP? So I mentioned the mitochondria here, ATP synthase here. You can see you need oxygen here, for example. You might have done glycolysis in your A-level biology. So, for example, glucose here, or with fats, beta oxidation of fats. This gets broken down, and you go through the TCA cycle, the citric acid cycle, and you can see that you produce, I've highlighted here a little star, you produce carbon dioxide. So this is at a cellular level, but you can relate this back at a whole body level. You can relate this back, because what it means is it means that if we understand, for example, that for 1 mole of glucose, you need 6 moles of oxygen, and you produce 6 moles of CO2, that is very important and helpful in itself. And if, I'll explain why in a second, and if you look at fat, it's a slightly different ratio here. 23 moles of oxygen makes 16 CO2, so the ratio is different. Now, this is important because if we measure like gross consumption, let's quickly fly back here, we might measure gross gas, for example, here we can actually collect air, so expired air, to measure the amount of O2 that you utilize overall and the amount of CO2 you produce. This gives us an estimation of overall how much energy metabolism is occurring, and also, which is really interesting, because the ratio is different, the relative amount of glucose and fat metabolism occurs, which is really interesting. We call this the respiratory quotient or respiratory exchange ratio, and that's measured by the volume of CO2 over the volume of VO2. So you get some interesting information from this. So you can relate back overall just by measuring respiration, how much O2 is consumed, how much CO2 is produced overall during the period. So it could be a rest period or with exercise or whatever. You can relate this back to overall metabolism, which is fascinating. And just to remind you here, so this is, so if you look at different things, you've got carbohydrates here, you've got fat as an example, protein, alcohol. So if you look, this RQ rate I mentioned, so the CO2 to O2 ratio is different. So it's actually 0.7. So what should happen, for example, just give an example, after an overnight fast, if you are healthy, metabolically healthy, you should be burning more fat as fuel at rest. And so your RQ level tends to drop during the night, during a fast, when you're not consuming food. If you then consume a meal that, say, could be mixed with some carbohydrates and some protein, could be, I don't know, eggs on toast or some cereal, some milk, then what happens, your metabolism changes. You start to shift to more glucose metabolism, and you could measure this, which is, again, fascinating stuff. And this is just a highlight. You can see here that the actual energy released, kilojoules per gram, because fat is very dense. Again, you might have already learned this in your A-level biology, is that actually you've got a lot more kilocalories. There's 39 kilojoules or 9 kilocalories per gram. So as I say, we can do this, and we do this in practical sessions. We have fun practicals in our year 2 of the course, where we do things like this, where we get students to measure at rest and with exercise using this called a Douglas bag system apparatus, where we can, for a few minutes at a time, we can measure the amount of uh, get your expired air. We can measure the volume of the actual air that's expired and the composition using gas analyzers. Then we use a very specific equation, the Weir equation. As a scientist back in 1949, Professor Weir in Glasgow, who did all the original validation work on this to create an equation to estimate energy expenditure. Going forward many years, obviously, some of the kit has become quite advanced, quite fancy, and so it means that in different situations, actually, you could measure energy expenditure, for example, during exercise, could be in the field somewhere, running around a track, or, for example, because we're actually linked, UCL is linked with UCL Hospital, and so we have lots of clinical teams that work together with dietitians, and for example, some of our courses we actually train our dietitians here to do different things, such as, for example, being if you're lucky enough to work, for example, in the ICU department, then you might do this type of stuff, where you use a hood, ventilation hood, and you can measure very accurately energy expenditure when someone, for example, is very unwell, lying in the hospital bed. That's important. The reason why, actually, no, actually, you tell me what's important. There we go. There's my question. That's just to make sure everyone's still there. So in the chat, tell us, why is this important? Why do we do these things? Imagine you're a sports nutritionist, you're trying to work out calorie requirements for an athlete, or you're a dietitian in a hospital. Why do you want to know this information? You there, Zoe? Can you see the chat?
I am, but I'm waiting for an answer.
Anyone, why is this so important? It's all anonymous. Just feel free to shout stuff out.
To ensure they have adequate energy to perform well,
Yeah,
and to
absolutely.
ensure the correct nutrition advice is being given.
Very good. Totally agree. And so, for example, so the idea really is to make sure we accurately assess dietary energy needs. We do a lot of research at UCL on this. I myself do work on this with athletes, for example. I have project students and PhD students, for example, looking at cancer patients, for example, at UCL Hospital. And again, the whole UCLH team works. I hesitate because there's so many different teams that work on these fields, which is around malnutrition and things like wasting. Because the idea is if you have someone who's, say, incredibly unwell, could be in the intensive care unit, for example, is someone could be completely physically inactive, just lying in a hospital bed, but because they're under a lot of stress, inflammatory stress, they're very unwell, is their metabolism could be at rest raised. And people have shown that it can be quite extreme, actually. If someone can't consume food either at the same time, and sometimes this could be also because we due to something called dysphagia, for example. It could be for lots of different reasons that you just cannot get all intake of food up to that level that's required to meet recommendations. So then you have to think about, for example, other ways of meeting requirements, which is enteral nutrition. So in our course, students learn this. They don't practice it because it's not dietetics, but it sets them up to then do, for example, they want to do dietetics afterwards as a separate course. So this stuff is really critical. So the importance of doing this is super essential. And with athletes, the issue is there are many examples with high performance athletes. If you see that if you can see my hands, if the mismatch becomes too great over a period of time, it means it impacts the performance, people lose weight, it affects their hormones, cardiovascular system, immune system, for example. And so they tend to have the symptoms of malnutrition and overtraining syndrome. And there's something called relative energy deficiency in sport, so we call it REDS. We do research on this here, so I supervise students every single year at BSc and MSc level look at this specific issue with a sports hormone specialist, an endocrinologist. So it's a very important and interesting issue because it affects health and clinical outcomes. So I say, so we cover this. We cover this in specialised modules in our final year. We have a sports nutrition module and an applied nutrition module. And as I mentioned, you see at the bottom here, this module in particular is very important because we cover the conditions that I mentioned, things like cancer and ICU, and we have specialised dietitians who come in person to talk about this from a clinical practice perspective. So it is very relevant to health and clinical outcomes. So we talked briefly about intake, talked about expenditure, so we measure all these things. But what about our body stores? So someone mentioned body mass index in the chat, but is there anything else? Is there any other way we can estimate energy stores? Anyone got any idea?
DEXA scan, bone density.
No, that's fantastic. That's great. Someone's been doing their research, so that's really super. Anything else?
Lean muscle mass.
Very good. Yeah, excellent. So you're right. And
Visceral fat.
yeah, great. So some of you have got a bit of an idea. So this is the thing. So starting off from the beginning, you probably all heard about body mass index. Okay. So again, in the course, we teach students all about this because it's a very controversial topic, I would say. So it is most basic level. So for example, you go to a GP and they measure your BMI and they'll tell you if you're in the normal range or you're overweight, for example. All this is a simple estimation of the relationship between weight and height. Okay. There is a general trend because if we take an average population group, and in general, on average, if, for example, this is from diabetes.co.uk, if, for example, you have a high body weight for height ratio, and you will probably have a high amount of fat mass, and we know that's been linked to, for example, things like metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and mortality. Okay, and similarly, on the other end of the spectrum, which we forget about, because it's actually a J-shaped curve, is that on the lower range that also increases risk of mortality. The problem is it's not accurate, and there are many examples where it really is not the best thing to do at all. It's a simple estimation. Best example is with power athletes. So if you have, for example, like a muscular rugby player, for example, weightlifter, bodybuilder has a high amount of muscle mass and low fat mass, then it really doesn't work. And there are other examples of clinical disease conditions where, again, it's not that good. And this is just a really nice, simple way to illustrate this story, okay? And I say, because it is only very much part of the story. So nice, this is just from a research paper. Imagine you've got 5 people here, all 70 kilograms, same body weight. And because this is the issue, the problem is our society has become pretty much fixated on body weight. This is a major thing. And even within the obesity world, you see that most of our studies, the primary outcomes of the studies is always body weight. Okay. So the problem is, let's take these 5 guys. You've got someone who's tall, someone who's short, someone who's muscular, someone who's inactive and sedentary. Different height. These guys have got the same height, but if you look carefully, I'll just point out first of all, this chap here is designated as being in the obese range. Because the same height as the tall chap, but because of this ratio of height to weight, technically classified as being in the obese range. If you closely look here, WC is waist circumference, so circumference of the waist, which is actually a fairly good indicator of how much fat mass you have around, we call it centripetal obesity. And that could be a combination of fat under the skin, subcutaneous fat, and visceral fat. Someone mentioned that in the chat. That's fat that surrounds the organs, okay? Which tends to be worse, actually, and linked to things like metabolic disease. This is SN, skeletal muscle. So, you see these two guys, perfectly healthy, normal, 24.2 body mass index. However, if you look carefully, it's the same weight, same height. This chap, though, is muscular, so much lower waist circumference. The other guy and has a lot more skeletal muscle mass. And probably, you have to look at other things as well, probably this person has a lower risk of metabolic and cardiovascular disease as opposed to this person. Obviously, though, and this is what we teach students in class as well, you'd have to look at other factors like diet quality, blood pressure, blood lipids, blood glucose, all these sorts of things as well. But it is an indicator. So this is what we do in class. This is what we teach people. You do not rely on the body mass index. Unfortunately, in standard NHS practice, we still pretty much, unfortunately, focus on this too much, I'd say. But what nutritionists and dietitians should do is look at body composition. And this is what we mean by body composition. What is the body made up of? So we have body fat that I mentioned could be distributed in subcutaneous fat. It can be in visceral fat, for example. But then we have our fat-free mass, which is everything that isn't fat, which can include skeletal muscle, our organs. And you have to remember the body's made up of water, both intracellular and extracellular water, and then bone tissue. And so there are other techniques where we can measure things like these and break it down. So there's scanning techniques, imaging techniques, like someone mentioned DEXA, for example. And then in other techniques, we can look specifically at different components and compartments, which is great. In class, this is some simple anthropometric assessment techniques that you can learn. This is what we do. So, for example, you can do circumferences, body circumferences of the limbs. So we can measure, for example, the upper arm, mid-upper arm, the waist circumference, the calf circumference, and then we can take skin fold measurements, thickness, essentially you see the calipers here. The idea is you can measure skin fold thickness, which is an indicator of subcutaneous fat, and using equations that have been validated from previous work, compared to gold standard or reference standard techniques, you can then estimate things like body fat mass. And for example, calf circumference is actually being used now as a standard method for muscle assessment, actually, because it's a very simple, easy technique to do. It's not wholly accurate gold standard technique, but it gives a good idea. Also in class, we do things like bioelectrical impedance assessment, which is a portable, practical technique that you can do. Some of the dietitians use this actually routinely now, which is fantastic in clinic. For example, at UCL Hospital or at Royal Free Hospital, the idea is that you have a device that puts a current through the body, a harmless current. Obviously, unfortunately, there's a few things that if you, for example, have a cardiac pacemaker, you couldn't have it if you're pregnant. But other than that, it's a very safe technique. And the idea is, again, if you've done physics, maybe some GCSE A-level physics, you might be aware of the idea that for current to flow, you need, for example, in the body, you need hydration. So the idea is to flow through ions, okay? That's the way the body works. Whereas fat mass, for example, is an insulator. So the current doesn't pass well through insulators. So again, from previous studies, where they've validated these techniques to, say, gold standard techniques, is they've developed equations, which means that we can estimate fairly accurately now, depending on the technique and device, things like fat-free mass, fat mass, body water, and also muscle mass. Again, we do this in practical sessions in class. Then you have more advanced and expensive scanning techniques, which are not portable. There are many techniques that are gold standard, like computed tomography and magnetic resonance imaging. DEX is a really interesting one. It's seen as a reference standard technique, but it's great. You can see it's a good example here where you can measure in blue bone mass. In the red, you can measure lean tissue. So organs and muscle, for example, you can see in the limbs here, you can see the red muscle, and then fat mass you can see in the yellow surrounding. So again, a really useful technique. And again, usually in clinic, in hospitals, then you do this for bone mineral content to measure bone density. So we teach students about these techniques. We don't use them routinely because they're expensive, not portable. And you also have radiation exposure, for example, with computed tomography, for example, CT scanning. So again, we teach students the pros and cons of different techniques and getting and critical evaluation. So that is a brief taster, right, of some of the content that we cover, why it's important. Okay. Has anyone got any questions or queries on that before we talk about the course? I'm keeping in track of time as well, because it's 7 minutes past 5 already. I end up talking too much, so apologies for that. Any questions at all? Oh, good. Right, so maybe at the end. So what I'll keep talking, of course, and then if you've got any questions at the end, feel free to ask. So,
Sorry,
nutrition.
there is one.
Oh, go on. Okay, sure.
Um, one sec. Are there any projects centered on agriculture practice or on socio-economic factors that affect diet?
Sorry, say that again. Is there any projects?
Any projects centered on agriculture practice or on socio-economic factors that affect diets?
Could we do that at the end? Because that's not related to the content, the taste of content. That's what we do. So I would say the first thing is that in some of the modules, we cover this part of content, but this is not a food science type course. That's very important to get across. This is much more medical focused, and I'll explain that in a second. So hence in the title. So it's a nutrition and medical sciences degree, fully accredited with the Association for Nutrition. It's a very novel degree. I don't know of any other degree like it in the UK, as far as I'm aware. And we've been going for 7 years now. So
There's another one related to the content. So, what circumstances or illness or disease would you need to use a DEXA scan?
why don't I cover that at the end? Now I've already started, so I'll cover that at the end. So, but good question. Thank you very much. Right. So back to the degree quickly. So the idea is that our course was originally developed on the back of the applied medical sciences degree, which was meant to be a course that goes into great depth of physiology and pathophysiology aligned with medicine, which is very interesting. And many of the students in the applied medical science degree actually go to graduate entry medicine. And so when this course was developed, the nutrition and medical science degree, the first year is very much closely aligned with this. So students learn all the basic physiology, pathophysiology of all the main systems, body systems. And then we go into very specific nutrition modules. But importantly, we cover everything to cover core competencies for Association of Nutrition Program accreditation, which is very important. I'll talk about later. But we do lots of very interesting cutting edge type stuff. And it's important to know it as well, which is really important. If you didn't know before, UCL is one of the best in the country and the world. It's always up there in the top rankings in the world of being a research focused university. And so hence we show this in our modules. We have experts teaching a whole range of cutting edge research related themes. So the stuff, for example, that you might see in the current news and current research around nutrition, nutritional sciences, we cover these things. So we have modules on things like obesity, malnutrition, nutrition metabolism, growth and development, sports nutrition, clinical nutrition, but also things like behavioural nutrition and frailty and aging, as well as public health nutrition. We also have optional modules on the microbiome, the nutrition of cancer, lots of different things which are very specialised. So in year 2, so we talked about year 1 briefly, this is where we get into much more, it's very much more nutrition focused, specifically. And so, for example, we go into nutrition metabolism more depth in term 1. We cover growth and development, and I'll talk about that in a few slides' time. So we cover everything from essentially pre-pregnancy all the way to older age as well, actually. Menopause and obesity. Now, because this is such an important topic, actually, we cover it across term 1 and term 2 in all different aspects, including things like eating disorders and cardiovascular disease from every different aspect and angle. Another key important thing to note is because research is so important, because we also want to set you up properly for doing research projects in the final year, and many of our students go on to do research afterwards, we think that strategically within our program, we try to embed stuff early on. So in year 2, for example, we have a statistical methods and research methods module, I should say, and then in term 2 here, we have a research methods module, which is important because it gets you thinking about what is research, how are studies designed, different things like outcome measures, study design, participant inclusion, exclusion criteria, and it gets you thinking about the type of project that you might want to do for your dissertation in year 3. So this is all being done very strategically. It's a strategic development to make sure that you guys, develop in the correct, logical ordering and timing, essentially. So you maximise your understanding of research, essentially, and do really well in dissertations. Then we have lots of other optional modules available. One of them, for example, is nutrition and cancer risk, which is an epidemiological module, where we look at things like the effects of different nutrients on foods in relation to cancer risk. Then in year 3, this is where we get to very specialised modules. So I mentioned applied nutrition as a clinical nutrition module. We have lots of dietitians and hospital doctors coming onto that module, talking about current practice in clinics, in hospitals, for example, of how patients are nutritionally managed across a whole range of different conditions. So, for example, we talk about renal nutrition, liver nutrition, pediatric nutrition, neurological disorders, a whole range of different things, actually. And so we're really very lucky because we're close aligned with the hospitals, UCLH and Royal Hospital. We have local experts who come in and give lectures on that. Now, I also mentioned sports nutrition a bit earlier. So I'm actually co-leading this module. I lead this module here, so there's things I'm actually personally interested in terms of research perspectives. And so this again is fascinating because again we have like sports nutritionists come in and sports dietitians come and give content, specific content on, for example. We cover everything from basic requirements and recommendations for athletes, then we go into some very specific things like nutrition for performance enhancement, and then clinical issues. So I mentioned REDS before, relative energy deficiency in sports, and that's something there that we cover. Now, you can see here we have these 2 important modules, behavioural nutrition and public health nutrition modules. These are pretty critical, I would say, because in all the things that we talked about so far, we talked about obesity, the obesity crisis. So when we look at things from a public health perspective, it is a set for any, I'd say, high quality nutrition course, current nutrition course, needs to cover this in depth now because of the nature of our society and the way everything's linked up. So, for example, if you want to change the health of society through public health campaigns, you need to understand how this functions and the research that's performed. And many of our graduates go on to, for example, do MSCs. We have a clinical public health nutrition degree at UCL, for example. And I can think of many graduates who've gone off to work in government departments, for charities, in the public health nutrition world to try to develop and improve, for example, it could be nutrition education for different communities. So going back to, for example, someone mentioned in the chat about do we cover, I think it is socioeconomic factors in agriculture. Is that right? Something like that? Is that the question? So that's where, for example, we would cover those aspects because they obviously impact upon, global community nutrition from every perspective, from the, understanding how the food chain works. So that's where we would cover that. But just to say again, we're not a food science course. So when you say agriculture, we don't cover it in huge depth, but we cover it from this perspective, understanding how it links to overall public health and overall outcomes. We have another whole range of optional modules available. So I've just highlighted some examples here of the ones that are available that the nutrition students tend to take. So obviously the microbiome has become a really big thing now in research and across the world. Everyone's talking about different supplements could affect the microbiome and all the rest of it. So there's actually a module that we run related to that is very popular. We have another module, nutrition cancer treatment, as I mentioned before, is that because we live at UCL Hospital and it's a world famous actually cancer department. They've got the Medical Cancer Institute right next to us. So we have this module which links to this module here. And so in this module, again, we actually cover what actually happens through cancer treatment journey for a number of different cancers. So, for example, we look at how things like, say, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, surgery affects different patient groups, how it impacts on nutritional status, and how we can modify that with nutrition. So we have experts, doctors, and dietitians on board who come and deliver lectures. If this is my area, frailty and aging, so we have a very specialised module in this. Now, again, you might be thinking, oh, so why is this important? I was literally teaching this yesterday afternoon to our MSc students. So if you're not aware, then you should be aware, hopefully, that the way our population dynamics have changed is quite dramatic over the past, say, 50 years. And then not only is there been a population, not only the population increasing across the world, but specifically it's the number of older adults, the proportion of older adults is greatly increasing. And actually, in some countries, the number of births is actually, declining. So if the proportion of older adults is increasing, the problem with that is that there's a big issue in that people live much longer, but the quality of life and actual health is not improving. So you have people with lots of comorbidities, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, all these sorts of things, osteoporosis, and this sarcopenia muscle waste that I'm talking about. So this is a big major public health concern. So we cover that in that module, and again, from all different perspectives. And we tend to have this every year, there's something for everyone. So some students are actually interested in going to work for biotech companies, biomedical companies, nutrition companies, for example. And so those of you who are interested in that, and we tend to have a couple of students each year who really want to do this type of work in the future, there's actually a biomedical entrepreneur module, which again is really fantastic. And then we have the dissertation project. So we stretch across both modules. And again, the idea was that's the reason why we have this logical pattern is that we develop ideas and research early on in year 2. So you're set up to do your dissertation research project, which can be anything. We have projects that are community based. We have projects, I think of some of my projects, we have a food bank project, for example. Again, very relevant. Someone mentioned about socioeconomic factors related to nutrition. And so we have links with food banks in the London area. Where, again, you're probably aware of this, because of the cost of living crisis, is that it's becoming more and more difficult for people to just buy food, right? And so we've got a hand raised. Apologies, we've got a question.
No, just a reminder, we have 9 minutes left.
I always do this. I'm sorry. I not too too much. Right. So we have lots of projects for everyone, and we have literature reviews, systematic reviews if you want to, data analysis projects, all sorts of different things, as well as recruiting participants, as sports nutrition projects, everything available, as well as lab-based projects. You know, if you want to do a traditional biochemistry molecular project, that's there too. So to finish off, last few slides, first most important thing to say, again, and if some of you might have chose UCL because it's in London, it's a world leader, that tends to be the first thing lots of people look at. It is genuinely, if you look at the rankings, it is a world leader in research. It's a very research intensive university. I think this is absolutely amazing. I'm just as being like a lecturer and course director, I'm really proud of this myself, and we have some really super modules with some great experts. I would say one of the best examples is our growth and development module in year 2, which is here. We literally have, and I'm not making this up, like several professors who are, you know, literally some of them are world leaders. They're people that have developed and written the textbooks on things like infant feeding. We are very, very lucky that, again, because it's part of UCL and part of this whole academic environment and atmosphere and all the different departments and divisions that contribute, we're very lucky. Good example, Professor Tim Cole. So if, for example, when you were growing up, you ever went to see your doctor and they put you against a growth chart, they said, well, okay, so for your age, what's your height and weight and where are you on the growth chart? Well, this chap, he's a professor of medical statistics, so he developed the growth charts with other experts as part of the World Health Organization programs, as an example. And we have other professors, for example, Professor Mary Futrell, who's an expert in infant feeding. So we're super lucky. And again, with some of the other modules I talked about, we have a lot of clinicians and dietitians who come in to give lectures. So again, this is, you know, we're very lucky to have this, and it really enhances our program. Another important thing for us to briefly mention, and Zoe, keep track of time for us, and be great.
6 minutes.
Thank you. So we try to teach you guys a load of transferable skills, a whole range of skills that you're going to take away from this. It's not just about learning general knowledge, you know, nutrition knowledge. It's about practical skills. That's why I did the tasting session like that, is because, for example, you can learn how to measure someone's dietary intake or their body composition or energy spectrum practically, okay? And as well as learning teamwork and skills, for example, we have a whole load of presentation assessments, both individually, as group, poster presentations, we've got video projects, a whole range of different things, because in the real world, if you're part of a team, you might, for example, develop something. You could do a report and then you have to present it to a group, or it could be for your job interview. So the end of this is, for me, it's lovely to see the evolution of people over the few years. It's really great. It's a great thing to see. But it means you can confidently walk into a job interview and know what to do, to be prepared, to do a really good PowerPoint presentation, know how to perform, how to conduct yourself in a professional manner. And that's what we want you to do, as well as all the other stuff. You know, for example, we have business case studies, literature reviews, practical reports, and general critical analysis development skills. I mentioned it being AFN accredited. Again, we're super happy about this, and I had some good news today in that the AFN's core courses were realigned in the past year, and our course is fully up to standards. So I had to do that work in the summer, so that's good. And so we're very happy about it. So if you're interested in that, because they don't have much time, I suggest you look up the Association for Nutrition. It is literally stamp approval. If you're looking for a quality nutrition course and you want to have a job in nutrition after this, you should go to a course that is accredited. That's very important. And to finalise as well, we have many students who end up working all sorts of different things. Because the nature of our course is very varied, cover many different things. We have students going to lots of different things, but in particular, lots of students want to go into things like dietetics and public health. And we find that what happens is, each year, there's usually about, say, 3 to 5 students who stay on at UCL to do one of our programs. So we have a very big MSc cohort. We have 4 programs: clinical and public health nutrition, a very specialised eating disorders and clinical nutrition module, obesity and clinical nutrition, and dietetics. So if you want to work in a hospital, work with patients, for example, um, we have a dietetics program. And this last year, we had 3 students go on who are now doing on the dietetics program. So there we go. Probably only got a few minutes to finish, but thank you very much. And any questions?
So, are there any work placement opportunity within UCLH during the course or afterward?
Yeah, so we don't do official work placements, but if you want to do shadowing with dietitians, that might be possible. And in our, for example, the supply nutrition module, you'll meet many dietitians. And in previous years, that's been possible, even if it's shadowing or for half a day or something, that's definitely possible. Full placements are not possible because it's not a dietetics program. But in the MSc dietetics, you do placements. Okay, so you need to be clear. This is a course where you become an associate registered nutritionist, not a dietitian. So you wouldn't be doing like actual clinical placements in the hospital. Not to say though, as I say, you're going to get shadowing experience, and that is definitely feasible. Anything else? Anything else, sorry? All good? Any last questions? Is there anything we missed?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Is the degree classification based on assessment in all 3 year, or is it just the last 2 year?
Yeah, so the first is only a tiny component. I think it's ninth, if I remember correctly. It's the third year that counts the most. If I'm, they have an exact calculation. It's like nearly 2/3, nearly 2/3 to put it correctly, something like that. The final year. So every year contributes, but the first year is minor. So it's low risk, which is good because you're just trying to find your feet and work out what you want to do.
And then how much time is lecture based versus practicals?
Yeah, so in the first year, we have a lot more wet lab type practicals. What was it during Zoe for yourself? How many hours per week?
I'd say about 2 hours a week. So we have one practical lecture every week, and then it's gonna be for about 2 to 3 hours.
And then the idea is then in the second year, for example, the practice do have a very focus on nutrition. So, for example, learning body composition assessment and energy expenditure. And usually for lectures, so as soon as you get to years 2, years 3, um, usually it's about, say, 2 to 3 hours per module, for example. And we try to put that together in one block. Also fully aware that some of you, for example, might have part-time jobs and things like that. We try to think about these things.
I think we have the last question. How do students choose their dissertation topics?
How do they choose a dissertation project to say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So usually what happens is I might talk to the students in the second year and I think the thing is trying to understand what the interest is. So if some of the students got a particular interest in a topic, then they can independently contact the supervisor. They can do that. or at the start or the end of the second year, is there's a list of projects that are sent out to students from lecturers and research and division leaders. And I think there are a whole range of different types of projects. So lab-based projects, public health, nutrition, literary projects, a whole range from everyone in the whole department. And then there's a specific process where students can like lock their choices, their first choice, second choice, third choice, or whatever.
We're out of time and we'll need to leave it here. So, however, if you could please provide us with your feedback about today's session by filling out our survey, which will appear in your browser at the end of today's event, it'll be greatly appreciated. Thank you for all your comments and questions, and thank you to Dr. Adrian Slee for the excellent session. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Sarah.
you.
Good to go. All the best.